Welcome to the 53rd episode of the New Ventures podcast. I'm your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regain Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. I host the New Ventures podcast to help people starting climate initiatives learn from others who are already progressed in these paths. In our series on climate change and food security, our guest for today is Anton Earle, Director of the African Regional Center at the Stockholm International Water Institute, which is executing the TRR project, transforming investment in Africa's rain-fed agriculture.
Thank you, Sanjoy.
Anton, you are working in the Zambezi project area. I'll start by asking you to take us, if you may, to this wonderful land.
Yes, of course. The Zambezi River is the largest river in southern and eastern Africa, with an annual flow roughly equivalent to what the Nile River has or the Rhine River in Europe has. So it's a substantial, large river system and 10 times bigger than the next largest river in southern Africa, which is the Orange River. So it's an important source of water for the communities that live along its banks in its watershed, but of course also for the population of the countries that live in the countries more broadly. So the total population of the people living in the watershed is around 47 million people. And the countries themselves that share the Zambezi, the 8 countries, have a total of about 168 million people. So we're talking about a substantial area of land and water. Its headwaters are in the northwestern parts of Zambia, from where the river flows roughly in a southerly direction and eventually makes its way eastward, passing through Zambia, bordering Zimbabwe, Botswana, and then through Mozambique, and flows into the Indian Ocean in Mozambique. There are amazing ecological sites to be seen along this river. The Barotse floodplains, for instance, are roughly 250 kilometers long and about 50 kilometers wide. And they are teeming with wildlife. Some of the largest herds of elephants, for instance, are found on these floodplains. I'm sure people are also very familiar with the Victoria Falls, one of the largest waterfalls in the world, and certainly the widest waterfall in Africa at about 1,600 meters wide. But in addition to the environmental sites that can be seen along the Zambezi, there are also amazing cultural sites that can be seen. So along the Barotse floodplains, for instance, the Lozi people migrate annually. As the floods come through the floodplains, they actually have a big ceremony where every year they'll move to higher ground, to areas that don't get flooded. And traditionally they have big boats that they sail over this time, and there's a big ceremony and a big festival that really takes place over this time to celebrate that move. So there's interesting cultural aspects to this basin as well. But then also technology and economics comes into play. With a basin this large, of course, it supports water supply for municipal water supply, industrial water supply, and increasingly for agriculture, supplying water to irrigation schemes. But in addition to that, it's also a very important source of energy for the region, developing hydropower through dams such as the Kariba Dam and the Kohora Bassa Dam that are both located on the main stem of the Zambezi. The Kohora Bassa Dam, of course, is interesting because it generates around 2,000 megawatts of electricity, which is then transported southwards to South Africa over a distance of around 2,000 kilometers, making the Zambezi River not only of importance to the 8 countries that share the river, but to countries further afield as well.
What is interesting for me as I hear you speak is the cultural movement of people as they prepare for the floods, because this is what we're going to talk about today, right? Climate change is disrupting these lives. Tell us a little bit about the climate change hotspots in these regions, because I know you've been doing a study on that topic.
Yes, that's a really interesting point, that Sanjoy, because the communities that we work with in the Zambezi catchment, who are primarily located in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi, when we visit them and we speak to them about issues related to climate change, the big difference is that they speak about climate change in the present tense. So when we speak to scientists and politicians, they typically talk about how the climate will change in the future. You know, by year 2050 or by 2100, it will be such and such. These communities talk about climate change in the present tense, something that they are experiencing today. They will talk about how the way the rains come, the timing of those rains are so different today that they can no longer practice agriculture in the way that their parents used to do it or their grandparents used to do it. And typically the big change is that the rains, when they do come, they come later than previously, and they fall in a shorter period of time. So the amount of rainfall overall is possibly not altered, but it's how that rain arrives on the ground. It arrives in a smaller number of very intense rainfall events, meaning that the problem becomes one of making it through the dry periods, making sure that the crops don't wither and die during the dry periods, but then also making sure that once the rain does fall, and it's very strong and intense bouts of rainfall that they do experience, that flooding doesn't become a problem. So farmers talk about their fields sometimes being washed away, seeds that they planted being washed out, and even to the extent that rivers are flooding in a way now that they weren't previously flooding, and actually washing away some of their agricultural lands. We visited a community in Malawi that is across the river from another community in Mozambique. And the river had actually changed its course as a result of a flood about a year ago, where it came down in a big flood, and when the flood waters receded, the course of the river had altered to such a degree that the Malawian community suddenly found themselves with their fields across the border in Mozambique. So these sort of changes are really putting strain on local adaptation systems. Communities are finding it difficult to produce enough food in the face of this changed climate.
Yeah, so produce enough food, and that is the interesting part. One solution coming from other parts of the world is to build large dams which across the river and irrigate these fields, which you have alluded to earlier. But your approach is actually the exact opposite.
Well, yes, our approach is different in that we are saying that irrigation is needed. Of course, irrigation is needed to increase agricultural yields and to improve resilience to climate change. But the challenges associated with building large dams and the large irrigation systems that have to go with them are multiple. The investments that are needed are huge. Your capital costs for building large infrastructure is really large, and then the operational costs are also really high. So in the interim, while we are still looking at ways of financing these large investments in irrigated agriculture, we need another solution, a solution that can be rolled out in the short term, but will also build sustainability for the long term. So by improving the way we work with agricultural land, which is really all about soil management, the farmers in Africa are really our frontline water managers, because what they do on their individual plots of land adds up cumulatively to a really big impact on water management of a basin like the Zambezi. So by working better with land management practices, you can increase infiltration into the groundwater, replenishing your groundwater aquifers, and you can reduce soil erosion and reduce sedimentation of water bodies. So by doing this, by working better on the rain-fed agriculture scale, you can also protect your investments in the large dams. So at present, in the Zambezi catchment region, only 3.6% of arable land is under irrigation. And even with all the ambitious plans that countries have put forward for their national plans for increasing irrigation to a large extent, which will more or less double irrigation, this will only take the irrigated area of arable land up to about 7% of all arable land. So there's still a huge amount of land that will be without irrigation, but is still good for agriculture. And that's where we come in, to say that by investing in your rain-fed sector, which is really around assisting farmers to work better with their land, largely based on a lot of the traditional practices that they would be doing anyway, but giving them some support in terms of the inputs and the materials that they might be drawing on. You can increase yields and reduce risk of climatic variation and variability through making sure that their plants have soil moisture at the root zone. And that's really what we are pushing to do.
And that is great. And I understand the way you say it as an interim solution. But to many people listening to this podcast, for example, the word rain-fed agriculture is a little bit more than subsistence farming. Can it be anything meaningful to these farmers?
The answer to that is yes. And the reason I say yes is that I've yet to meet a farmer that willingly chooses to be a subsistence farmer. All the farmers that we speak to talk about wanting to be able to produce an excess of food, but they can, of course, then also be selling into the local market. So the approach is to really say that, well, if we can make investments in the soil and your soil management practices, in that way, we can make sure that the rainfall that is available, whether it comes directly from rain onto the soil or whether you're capturing it through roof water harvesting systems or making use of shallow wells in the area and then applying that to your fields, but essentially making use of your local water resources. Once you start using that effectively, you actually reduce the risk of crops failing due to a lack of moisture at the root zone. And once you achieve that point, you also find that farmers are more willing to make investments into their fields. So that they start doing is buying better seed varieties, for instance. So better seeds that actually produce more or more drought resilient would only be invested in if the farmer knows there's a good chance that they would have sufficient moisture during all the growing cycles of that crop. Better seed varieties also then get coupled with improved soil nutrients, whether locally produced or bought in. But all of these measures go together to ultimately increase yields. And we are seeing in some of the communities that a doubling of yields from the baseline scenario is entirely reasonable to expect. But we are seeing that comes through quite easily. So the point is to allow communities, allow individual farmers to break out of a subsistence cycle, produce enough and start producing in excess, and then, of course, accessing markets to be able to sell that excessing crop.
And we will obviously get down a little bit more in detail in the project that you are doing in the Zambezi region. But just to step back for a minute, is this issue of rain-fed agriculture and better water practices, is this applicable to all across the developing world?
It is to some degree. That different continents differ in the way that agriculture is done in the different continents. So in terms of arable land under irrigation, I mentioned earlier the Zambezi countries are around 3.6% currently and aiming to get themselves to 7%. The average for sub-Saharan Africa at the moment is that about 6% of land is under irrigation. Now contrast this to Asia, where around 37% of arable land is currently under irrigation. So a much higher percentage of arable land is under irrigation in Asia. And that has a lot to do with geography. You have large plateaus across the Gangetic Plains and the Lues Plateaus around China and so forth that are very naturally well suited to large-scale irrigation schemes that supply that water. Where Africa, not as much of the land is well suited to irrigation, as a function essentially of the topography of Africa. It's you don't have those really large-scale flat plains. You have a lot more steep slopes up and down, making irrigation a bit more difficult to do over there. So this, in some ways, is specific to Africa, where you have in much of sub-Saharan Africa conditions that you have enough rainfall for agriculture to take place, that it's topographically challenging and difficult to introduce large-scale irrigation, which means you really need to make use of that rainfall that you receive in the best way possible.
Okay, Anton, we will jump into understanding this project in far more detail, but just to sum up key things that we've heard so far, to me there are two real important things that you said. One is climate change in these regions, which is a front line, is in the present. That's absolutely important for us to understand. The other important point that we need to understand, nobody wants to be a subsistence farmer. Everybody wants to produce more and sell more so as to put away something for a dry day. The technology and the practices that allow farmers to use more rainwater at the soil root to be able to grow more crops gives them the confidence to buy better quality, climate-resistant seeds, better agricultural inputs, and that allows them to sort of break away from the subsistence catch-22 situation that they find themselves in. And I think what we will try and understand in the next part of the podcast is to take you up on this point that you mentioned, that there are enough examples where yields have risen substantially from baseline scenarios. So I'll ask you to sort of begin that by telling us, tell us a little bit about those examples. Bring them to life, if you may.
Certainly. It's interesting when we meet with the communities that we work with. I recall a community that we were working with in Malawi on the slopes of Mount Malanje, the south of Malawi. And I asked the chief of that community if she could speak to international leaders, to her own politicians in Malawi, and ask for support. What would she ask for her community? And very quickly she answered back and said, 3 things I would ask for. The first is that we want equipment that will help us to work the soil. Better hoes, better pickaxes, better shovels, maybe a wheelbarrow. Number 2, she asked for improved agricultural inputs, better seed varieties, better nutrients, better fertilizers, and so forth. And the third thing she was asking for was better access to markets. And that for me actually really symbolized exactly what it is that communities are looking for when they're asking for assistance. They're not asking for very, very much. It's not millions and millions of dollars this per community. It's relatively modest amounts where they need this sort of assistance. And a lot of it, of course, is also tied with capacity building and training and looking at some of the best ways of working with soil. And once this is done, we start seeing on the community scale an improvement in agricultural systems. So some of the local partners that we work through in these countries, and I must stress that that's also really important, the partners are local, locally rooted organizations working with the communities that they are serving. And very often, well, in most cases, the staff working for the NGOs that we work with actually come from those same communities. So there's a close link over there. So these organizations understand these communities really well. And they work with the communities. They provide some of the training and the capacity building and some of these basic agricultural equipment. They also help them with getting access to improved inputs. So the seeds and the fertilizers I mentioned, but not only by allowing them to buy these things, in many cases, training the communities up how to improve the seed stock that they have. So they've actually got very sophisticated programs in Zimbabwe, for instance, where local communities are now producing improved and hybridized seed varieties through a whole breeding program in the rural areas. And then they develop seed banks for the entire community, where when you want to access improved seeds, you make a withdrawal from the bank and you can use those seeds on the agreement that you always pay back double the amount that took out originally. So the seed bank is constantly growing. And a lot of these seed banks are also playing an important role in conserving some of the heirloom seed varieties that have maybe gone out of commercial practice, but they are still important seeds because they improve biodiversity and improve resilience to climate change. So multiple benefits coming through from this multi-pronged approach. But what we do see is that there's no lack of innovative and successful projects. Good projects are aplenty across Africa. But what we're lacking is a translation of these good projects to large scale. So what we need is to really scale these up and get large scale government support for these sort of projects and interventions, and also the international community being interested in saying, but this is an investable sector. We can actually work within it. So the individual projects are plentiful and very good in their own right. So the communities we work with, we are helping them to develop a empirical data-based monitoring system that will really look at what the benefits are for investing in improved rain-fed agriculture. So for every dollar you're investing, what are you getting back for that dollar?
This is great, Anton, especially the topic that you bring about where communities are working on their own seed banks and in particular rejuvenating or, bringing to life, if you may, the lost varieties which help biodiversity and climate adaptation. Tell us, what have you seen, the data about the benefits of all these practices?
Well, so the benefits that are coming out of this, we quantify systematically over 3 areas. So the first area is really the benefit to the farmer. So benefit to the farmer through improved soil management, improved agricultural practices should always translate in an increase in crop yield. And I must also stress that's an intensification of crop yield. It's not by expanding agricultural area into areas that are natural areas and so forth. We actually want to intensify agricultural areas that are currently being cultivated. So that's the first main benefit that we are seeing, and we'd like to get more data on that. The second benefit, of course, is the broader environmental benefit. So I spoke earlier about the increased percolation of rainwater into the underground water tables, so groundwater benefiting from that and improving. And then, of course, a reduction in soil erosion and a reduction in sedimentation of water bodies, such as rivers and dams. So that's a broad environmental benefit that could be claimed in environmental service as such from investing in improved rain-fed agriculture. And the third range of benefits we are seeing and measuring now would be your broader societal benefits. So at a community level and across the agricultural value chains. So looking at the input side, so small businesses that are able to sell into those agricultural value chains, and also to be buying produce that is produced and can be taken to market. And that's a job creation opportunity, which, of course, in the context of rural Africa is really important because you have a large young population with very few job opportunities in the rural areas. So there's a natural migration from rural to urban areas. So we are seeing that by improving agricultural prospects in these rural areas, you're actually creating economic opportunities for young people, and especially for women. There's a strong gender dimension to this. You'll find that very often the irrigation schemes that are developed tend to favor men because men have more formal access to land. They hold the title deeds to the land, for instance. So when an irrigation scheme gets developed, it's typically the men that get included in the irrigation scheme, and women are frequently the ones who have to still then fend for themselves in terms of rain-fed agriculture. So by focusing resources in this sector, you can have some very transformative benefits at a societal level.
Each of these benefits are worth getting into, but just to keep our eyes on the increase in yield for a minute, you mentioned earlier on in the podcast that yields can rise substantially, right? Can you give us some data, some stories to help justify that point?
Yes. So typically in your, let's call it the unimproved rain-fed scenario, where the inputs are being kept to the minimum because farmers feel it's too risky for them to go off and buy higher value seed varieties or better fertilizers because they're so unsure about the rains. In that kind of scenario, we typically see about a yield of about 1 ton per hectare, depending on the crop. But let's say maize as being a staple crop in much of sub-Saharan Africa, 1 ton a hectare is about where it lies. Now, once we see communities that have been adopting improved soil management practices for 2 to 3 years and managing to hold back some of the moisture, some of the rainfall, and apply that to their soils at the right time, coupling that, of course, that with an improvement in the agricultural inputs like fertilizers, like better seed varieties, most of those communities will start achieving 3 tons per hectare without a problem. Depending on where they're located, we have come across some communities under some project schemes that get right up to about 5 tons a hectare. But typically it's going from about 1 ton a hectare to 3 tons a hectare. So 3 tons a hectare is still lower than what you might typically have gained with a full irrigation system, which can take you anywhere up to between 6 and 8 tons a hectare. But then you have to look at your return on investment. So improving rain-fed agriculture, typically we talk about roughly $100 per hectare to improve a piece of land and improve the inputs. Irrigation comes out to around $12,000 per hectare, according to World Bank statistics. So there's a huge difference there in terms of what you have to invest. So your yield is not just around what you are getting per hectare, per area of land, but it's about the money that you are investing. So per dollar invested in rain-fed agriculture, you're getting a lot more back proportionally than from the irrigated agriculture.
Very nice. I'll just try and understand a little bit more, Anton, of the soil management and the water management practices that you allude to. Are they practices that the communities know but have forgotten? Or are these practices something that you bring from outside, if you may, to these communities?
Most of the innovative practices that we see being introduced by our local partners in these countries are based on practices that have been used in the past. So approaches like terracing or digging deep beds have been used in the past. But over time, for one reason or another, people have that's fallen out of favor. It hasn't been used as much. So a lot of these approaches are really based on these traditional practices. Our partner in Malawi developed an approach called deep bed farming, where they essentially dig the soil down deeper to prepare it, introduce organic matter almost a meter underground, meter to half a meter to a meter underground, which provides nutrients and so forth, and create channels between these beds that are very effective at holding back the rainfall that does fall. And this was actually based on an approach that was previously used in Malawi many years back. But over time, the soils have degraded to the extent that the top layer of soil has become so hard that to dig soil out to that extent is physically very demanding. So they are trying to help communities to be able to prepare soil beds in this way by supplying better equipment to them. In some cases, even managing to get mechanized equipment that can actually dig out these soils, introduce the organic matter into the soils, and improve the way that they actually hold back the moisture. So it's really a combination of building on what has been done in the past, but then also looking at innovative approaches being used in different places as well, and blending those and finding the best.
And in terms of the other things, you talked quite a bit about climate-resistant seeds, which I sort of understand, but you also mentioned market linkages, right? Tell us a little bit about how these form. From my previous work, I was thinking a little bit about renewable energy-based storage and processing centers. I was thinking a little bit about weather monitoring services, providing information to farmers of when it'll rain, how much it'll rain, and so on and so forth. I seem to understand a little bit that a collusion of these services is needed, but I would love to understand a little bit more about how they play out in practice.
A wide range of support services are really needed for rural agriculture to flourish. You mentioned one of them being access to markets. So a challenge that has been faced in many of the rural areas is that in the years when an excess of crop is produced, so crop in excess of what that family might need for their own needs, the challenge is how do you store that excess in a way that it doesn't go off, that it doesn't rot and doesn't spoil. So storage of the crop becomes a challenge. So one of the NGOs that we've been working with in Zimbabwe have developed an innovative low-cost way of improving grain storage to the degree that they can allow a family to store grain that will see them through an entire year, 1 year cycle, all stored in a way that the air is removed from that grain so it doesn't rot, it doesn't go off, it doesn't have pests that come into it, and that grain can also then be sold off as and when that family chooses to sell that grain and sell it into the market when prices are favorable for the farmer. So just a simple grain storage technology like that can actually make a huge impact. Of course, in the long run, you want certain things to happen like better transport routes, better access to those markets, which will take longer to develop. But in the interim, having better storage facilities at farm level or at community level makes a huge impact. Then in terms of better understanding what is going on with the weather systems, with the climate systems and the soil moisture content, that's also really important, because if a farmer is to decide to make that investment to get better seed varieties and so forth and put them in the ground, they want to have a reasonable assurance that there's enough moisture there to warrant that investment. So we've seen an interesting startup, for instance, that's developed a technology that can measure soil moisture content in a very low cost way. So sensors that can be put into the soil and kept there and essentially tell farmers whether their soil is dry, medium dry, or moist. Essentially, a very basic system, some lights that go on, and they can do this at around about $40 for field. So it's affordable to farmers, manufactured locally and supplied to them. And they're starting to use this increasingly. And these sort of technologies are also hold the benefit that even if the farmer does have access to irrigation, you can still use these technologies to increase your yield. Whether you're doing the rain-fed system or the irrigation system, you're always going to benefit from improved agricultural inputs and improved soil management. So training farmers up on how to improve their soils so that it does hold back more water would also have a positive impact in an irrigated environment. And then using these digital tools to tell them more about what the soil moisture is really doing can also, in an irrigated sense, reduce the risk of over-irrigation, which can also happen in those systems. So we're trying to look at a range of different approaches that provide benefits no matter what system of farming is actually implemented. And there's some partners that we've come across that are using smartphone-based apps to train farmers on long-term weather predictions. So that gives them a better sense of when does it make sense to actually put your seeds in the ground? When should you actually be making that investment based on what the weather forecast is coming in the coming weeks and months? And that's really valuable information for farmers to reduce their risk, because everything goes around risk. It's a risk putting better seeds into the ground when you're really unsure about what the rainfall is going to be doing in the coming months. So bringing digital tools and best practice to bear on this is a real innovation area, and one where I can see huge possibilities for partnerships with digital service providers.
The other thing that I found very interesting in what you said is about the societal transformation, especially, you made the point about gender, right? And I can imagine not only women, but perhaps marginal communities would not have access to land, which is precondition for benefits from the large irrigation systems. Again, that is a very important topic, and what would be really fascinating is if you could make that come alive for our audience with a story or a couple of stories.
So in a lot of the communities that we visit across the Zambezi catchment, what always strikes me is the very proactive role that women play in agriculture. So we will go with the NGOs that we are working with, the local NGOs, and start talking with communities and having the communities show us what it is that they are doing. And 9 times out of 10, it'll be one of the women that actually show us what is going on. And the men are there, they are present, and of course they're also working, and they're working the fields. But the real understanding of the nuances of some of these systems is really held by the women in many cases. I can remember one couple, as a husband and wife, their family that was working a couple of hectares of land, and they had some of it under maize, and then they also had some cattle, some goats and chickens and so forth. And they were practicing essentially a circular farming type of system where they were using the manure from the cattle to produce nutrients for their soil. So a very good way of capturing all of those various nutrients, combining this with household waste and so forth. And they were managing to break away from subsistence level in quite a direct way, sending their kids to school, buying school uniforms for them and the books that they had to take to schools and so forth with the extra that they were making. And it got to the extent that when we started asking more detailed questions, the lady, the wife, farmer, she went off and got a book where she was keeping tally of all the production levels over the years. And she was the one that knew about all of this. It was her book, and she could refer to it and come up with the exact data, how much she managed to produce in one season, how much of that she sold out, how much she kept back, and those sort of things. That was really interesting. So we always talk about the farmer and the farmer's wife. Well, in this case, it was very much the farmer and the farmer's husband. And, it wasn't being hidden at all. And I think we really have to acknowledge that, is that women are actually very in control of agriculture in many of the rural parts of Africa. And yet we are not seeing it as a sector where young women, where girls will look at and say, well, that's what I want to do. I want to get into agriculture. And I think that's where the shift has to happen, because the reality on the ground is that women are playing a very strong role in smallholder agriculture and trying to break out of that subsistence cycle.
As we come to the end of the podcast, this is obviously fascinating. You said that more investment is needed. You talked a little bit about the amount of investment that is needed in rain-fed agriculture. And granted, it is lower than large-scale irrigation. Now, my question is, are these investments needed in the equipment, the hose and maybe even the mechanized tilling that you have talked about earlier, and in the services that are required? Just help us understand what these investments are needed for.
I would argue that investments are needed across the entire rural agricultural value chain. So right from your implements that you're using at farm level, there's opportunities there for improving those implements, whether they're the most basic implements to moving to something that introduces some degree of mechanization. Then across to the actual input. So we've spoken about seeds and fertilizers and so forth that can be positive. And then, of course, to the models for purchasing agricultural output. And I think that there's some opportunities there for some of the food companies that do buy food to enter into agreements with smallholder farmers, but at scale. So you'd obviously need some kind of a clustering together of smallholder farmers, but there's some good examples of that happening as well. And that these food companies, of course, can then also be helping to make some of these investments in their input, and then ensuring that they've got a sustainable supply chain, essentially, of staple foods that are coming in. And I think increasingly when we speak to some of these larger food companies and the investors that are behind them, they see agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa as a great potential investment area. They see the possibility of realizing a good rate of return, given that food is always in demand. One of those products, we will always need food, of course. The question is, where is it produced, by whom, and at what time of the year? So smallholder farmers in Africa certainly have the capacity to increase the amount of food that they produce. We could easily see a doubling in total of agricultural output at the smallholder level, which represents a substantial amount of food, which also then decreases the need for importing food into Africa. Because remember, for every bag of maize or wheat that you import into Africa, it's the equivalent amount in dollars that leaves the continent. It's the equivalent amount in jobs that aren't created on the continent in Africa, that rather get generated somewhere else in the world. So by stimulating local agricultural production, you're also stimulating local jobs and local economies that start actually then getting activated and start growing and improving over time. So that's really what we're wanting to see, and see, what are the business models that you need for businesses to get involved in the sector and for financiers to put money into the sector.
And when you say investment is required across the value chain, obviously that involves public investment as well. If the audience of this podcast is a corporate foundation, either in the food industry or in a corporate foundation focused on climate change, if they had to listen to this podcast, what would be your message for them? How should this investment flow into making a systemic change, into making, as you said earlier on the podcast, making these connecting the dots between these projects and making a substantial change in yield across a particular region or across a particular commodity?
What we would like to see is a situation where the local organizations, the NGOs that are helping support farmers in these countries directly, so the ones who really know them, they know their needs and so forth, what we'd like to see is a situation where these organizations become more sustainably financed. At present, when we speak to them, they are doing amazing work, really impactful work, most of them transforming communities where they do manage to implement projects. But their funding is not very sustainable. So when you look at their record keeping, and one of the partners we work with has been in existence for nearly 40 years now in Zimbabwe, and they've got very good records showing how many communities they work with. It fluctuates wildly over the years. So there's some years where they show that they've managed to work with several hundreds of thousands of farmers, and other years it drops right down to the tens of thousands. And when you ask them about that, they'll always say, well, a big project came to an end, and then it took us a while to get new funding and develop a new project around that, and then it goes up again. And I think every time they have a dip like that, they lose out on some farmers that they could be supporting over the long term. So to try and smooth that out, what we would like to see is a regional fund that can invest in these organizations for the long term and break away from a project type approach to say that let's invest in you, and you in turn, of course, then work with the farmers. And you'd want to see certain performance indicators that are achieved. And most of the organizations we work with are actually very aware of that. And they've got sophisticated monitoring and evaluation processes in place built into their projects, which could be used very easily to secure long-term financing for their operations to work with those communities and to scale that up and prevent the situation where every 5 or 6 years they go into a dip in funding and then have to scale back on their activities for a few years. And I stress that this should be at regional scale, not just one country, but several countries, so that you can also make use of some of the cross-border flows that do happen between these countries, both in terms of people, but also in terms of the goods that are produced. So if you produce agricultural excess in one country, it could be exported to the neighboring country and vice versa. So adopting a regional approach also brings benefits.
This has been a fascinating podcast. And as we come to an end, I'm going to just summarize some of the key things that I have learned in the process. For me, the examples that you gave of what communities are doing, what individual farmers are doing, and what your partners are doing to work with those communities is absolutely fascinating. What I've learned is that yields do increase. What I've learned is that some of these practices were, as we kind of suspect, were known to the generations before, but as land has got degraded, has the modern practices in agriculture have made their presence felt, these have been forgotten, but it can be revived with support and with nurturing. And this, what I call bottom-up revival, if you may, leads to societal change, which simply top-down infrastructure development does not lead to. The message to a corporate foundation is to create a long-term fund that enables these community-led organizations to work on this problem for 10 years, because this is the problem of our generation and the problem of the next generation also. So creating this change is not a 2-year or a 3-year project with a log frame. It is a 30-year project with a vision. That's the message. But to me, Anton, I'll also say this, that one message that I personally, hearing you, would like to leave for the corporate foundations is to help fund partnerships. It is important to fund local organizations. But the point that you mentioned about that you need a variety of services. You need digital solutions. You need weather data. You need organizations that measure soil moisture. You need market linkages. You need farm to fork companies. you need, companies which provide financial inclusion. They all have to come together. And I think one of the problems in funding in climate change is that it funds individual projects. It does not fund the building of the constellation of organizations who are working in silos in their own area to come together and attack the problem in its entirety. And that would be also my message to corporate foundations.
Yes, I think that sums it up really well, Sanjoy.
If people want to get in touch with you, how should they?
The people are welcome to contact me by email. My email address is anton.earle@siwi.org, and I can spell that. That's ANTON.EARLE@SIWI.org.
Thank you very much, Anton.
Great. Thank you very much, Sanjoy and Sadia.